evening and welcome to another edition of the Business Perspective for today, January 5th, 2012. Let me start off by wishing you good gentlemen and the viewing public happy, healthy, and a very rewarding 2012.
Thank you.
Tonight we will start a new series on public finances, and for that we have two distinguished guests. Before going to our first break, we would like to thank our sponsors, Brothers Habet, Pandora's Wonderbox Nursery, the Angelus Press, Idea Lab Studios, and of course the BCCI Western Union, the only network that has been awarded the 5-star Quality Service Award by Western Union. Thank you, and we go to our first break. Welcome back. This evening we have very special guests with us. On my left we have Mr. Joseph Waight, a career public officer who rose through the ranks and is now the financial secretary of the government of Belize. Quite frankly, the most senior of senior public officers. And if you want to know how important he is, look at your dollar. Look at your paper money, and his signature is there. Our other guest needs really no introduction. The Honorable Godwin Hulse, Senator representing the private sector. Gentlemen, good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome.
Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
This evening we want to look at public finances, to look at the trends, more at the macro level, the big picture, as it relates to the growth in government's budget, the revenue, expenditure, certainly the ballooning public debt. From my own perspective, and not to prejudice the discussion this evening, it looks fairly bleak, and it raises a question: is this really sustainable in the long term? Mr. Waight, probably you could start off.
Well, you know, it's always a challenge. I'm not sure it's as bleak as you may see it at first glance, but it is a challenge. I mean, that is, here we have a situation where we're already getting our tax to GDP ratio is still fairly high. It's about 21% or so tax to GDP. That means that we're collecting a fair amount of tax. We have to also consider the incidence of tax. The incidence of tax, where is it falling? What segments of the population is paying the tax? And I think this is where we may get into some further discussion. And then the sources of tax. Where is the tax money coming from? I mean, the traditional sources and then non-traditional sources. So we have a revenue envelope, so to speak. Direct taxes, indirect taxes, service fees and charges on one hand, and in the last budget that altogether was in the area of about $750 million or so, plus or minus a few tens of millions. But on the other side, you have your recurrent expenditure, your claims against the budget, and of course there's a cascade, there's a waterfall, so to speak. I'd like to think that the first claim against is you have to pay your debts, you have to pay your pensions, you have to pay your utilities, and then you pay your wages and salaries, leaving perhaps maybe 15% or so discretionary to pay for other maintenance of other programs and that type of thing. And the real challenge is to balance things and to leave a little bit of surplus so that you can invest and the government can carry on its capital expenditure program. So really, it's a challenge. As I say, the challenge really is to ensure that your revenue is collected, first of all, fairly, equitably, trying to get from those sectors who have the surpluses, and then you do a redistribution to those that do not through your expenditure programs, particularly your social services. But the idea is you can't kill the goose that's laying the egg. And they say that the art of taxation really is plucking the goose without making it squawk too much. But you know, that may be a little bit of a light side, but the idea is to try to get from your system, and through some growth and equitable collection, try to get a fair share of taxes. You don't want to overtax people, because then you becomes into a decreasing marginal situation. But at the same time, to control, on the other hand, where you maybe have more control on, is expenditure, bearing in mind these must-haves, these first claims that I mentioned earlier. So really, your discretion is about 15 to 20% of the budget. Really, you have discretion on, and that's your operating expenses, some of your goods and services, things like utilities. You try to cut back, but certain givens are pensions, certain givens are debt, and we get into debt in a moment. And when we have this ever-increasing wage bill, because we're the biggest employer in the government service. So basically, it's a balancing act, and it's a challenge every year.
Senator, your opening comments?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and I do wish both of you and Belize as a whole a better and prosperous 2012. When I look at public sector money, I always think that it is the only entity around the world that doesn't earn its revenue per se, doesn't go out there and work for it. It raises it by virtue of taxation. And that then depends on, as FinSec said, a balance. I mean, if you pluck that goose too hard, those who are plucking won't be there too long, because people will squeal. But at the same time, I think there's a responsibility to develop a conscience in those who pay of that responsibility rather than a burden. And the way that is developed is by making it equitable, by being transparent with your spending, so people can see where their money is going, and then people will be inclined not to just pay it. They'll be inclined to pay it. When people don't see where it is being spent, when there is not enough transparency, when they feel that too many people are getting away, when they feel the system is cumbersome, then you get into all the dodging and hiding and evasion, etc., which indeed we must face plagues Belize to a large extent. But at the same time, government has to go on, government has to pay these things that FinSec mentioned, and it needs the private sector to continue to grow, to continue to generate more revenue. I have always seen taxation, for example, the $750 million referred to. If we doubled the economy, and that was all government needed, we have the tax, in a way. And in a place like Belize, where there is a tremendous amount of resources and potential, it's not hard to do. It is the policies that are employed to try to do that create some of the difficulties we have. But if we could find a mechanism to push the productive sector, to get our exports up, to reduce our balance of trade, or to get it in the positive, you would see this small amount then that government requires out of it as becoming minuscule in terms of, and as Joe said, the GDP to tax ratio, it would change significantly. Right now it looks stiff because it's a small amount of people paying, and that is where the problem comes in.
I quite agree with the Senator. The thing is that the government has a dual role to play, basically to provide the infrastructure that would be then catalyst for investment and for private sector development, and at the same time to provide things like public goods, to the security, education, health services that would then the so-called enabling environment. But at the same time, one has to be careful that you don't use those as they don't turn to be disincentives, because remember, there's competition everywhere. Competition across, I mean, especially with the opening and liberalization now, CARICOM, free trade and all of that. So we have to be very careful. We can't be, we have to be careful that we provide the correct mix of incentives, try to get a piece of the surplus that's generated in your economy through growth. But at the same time, you don't want to stifle it, because you want the private sector to take the lead, create jobs, and therefore keep the economy going. You want a growth rate of 2.5–3% at the minimum. Just to stay in place. The growth rate has to be linked in a sense to your population growth rate. I mean, it is, if your population is moving fast, like in the south, you have to provide schools and other things for them. And you really do need to have that economic growth to provide the resources to pay for and it's a circular situation in a sense.
It's almost sometimes, though, Joe, I say a chicken and an egg situation. If you look at what Joe just said, FinSec just said, the priorities are pensions, wages, utilities, and debt servicing. It's a priority. There's a small amount left for capital development, and so you continuously have to borrow. That increases the foreign debt, increases the national debt. But Really, that is where the emphasis is needed. If you take, for example, the South, Placencia, just the fact of fixing the road changed significantly the economic activity and structure there and revenue for government. Because when you had to hammer down there over 2 hours, by the time you get there, you have to think, but come nobody going. Now you can run there, putting electricity into certain areas, putting better bridges and customs buildings, all of which only public sector will do. Those kinds of investments is what drive it. But you have to make that investment first, which means you have to borrow that money, you have to be able to pay it back, you have to project it, and you have to secure the lenders.
The capital side of the budget.
Yes, in selection of it has to be in the selection of the projects you're doing. I mean, a project should have a financial rate of return, an economic rate of return to be able to pay if you have to borrow the resources to invest, to fund it, to pay that back, as well as to generate and other benefits that would attract private sector investment. The South is a good example.
Right.
The investment in the Southern Highway, for instance.
Yes.
We're going to spend perhaps in next over the next 2.5 years close to $50 million in finishing the section from I think it is from the dump to the border. I would like to think that we will get that back in economic return in 3 years.
You absolutely will.
In 3 years.
You absolutely will.
Of course, you have to put in there other things, customs control, immigration control, but it's going to open up an entire new area, and that's the type. It's a selection of the investment, and we hope that will generate enough income to not only pay for the investment there, but to generate a surplus elsewhere, and also to pay for some of the debts that we're carrying on the books that may not have been as productive as these on the table.
Because Hulse and I have been involved in the trade negotiations and the NTNC for a long time, we know, for example, and I mean it's well documented around the world, you make that kind of investment, you improve your ports, and everything balloons, because you begin to have a serious amount of economic activity, movement of goods, movement of people. When you don't have roads, when you don't have ports, you're just plain stagnant, because you can't get there.
But you know, yes, the capital infrastructure is vitally important. It's essential for you to be able to move goods and services, for you to have as the basis for economic development. But coming back to one of the points you made, as it relates to the recurrent expenditure and the provision of services by government, more and more, I believe, in the private sector, we're seeing a decline in the quality of services from the public sector. Yet we see the recurrent expenditure growing. Over the last 10 years, I think we've had a near doubling of the revenue base, but also to a near doubling of the expenditure. But yet, the complaints we hear from both within the private sector and those requiring the services of government, healthcare in particular, there seems to be a decline. I think we need to look at maximizing, streamlining, increasing efficiency, and just not growing for growing's sake, but growing based on the same logic to capital expenditure appears required in much greater detail on the recurrent side.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly that in fact we need to get more return because look, if you look at the Millennium Development Goals, one of it is a percentage of your budget you spend on education. We are about 3 times where I mean the ceiling, but are we getting 3 times the return? And I think universal education is a good concept. Universal health is a good, but can we really afford it, or do we try to put in there some type of change incentive system so that we pay on the output rather than input? Right now, in the education system, we pay the salaries and the classrooms and all of that, but we don't really emphasize the output that's coming out. I mean, it is, do we fund the school depending on the number of graduates, the number of passes, the number of PSE, percentages, that type of thing. So I think the incentive has to change a little, and we pay and sponsor more for the output.
But that is a problem that public sector will always have, because public sector has other issues. Private sector generally tries to have value for money management. I mean, and is rigid about it. Public sector can't be so rigid about that because it's tied into politics, it's tied into everything, and therefore if it was only the bureaucracy per se managed strictly by competent managers, that would happen. Somebody doesn't produce, they go home. But let's face facts. Can't happen because he or she is tied into the political directorate as well to a large extent, which makes these decisions because there are a lot of other political considerations. So you don't get that level of efficiencies out of government. I mean, Belize is is not unique. I mean, you look across in Europe, you saw what they were saying about Greece and everything and how bureaucratic and inefficient and wasted. But this is the reality. So how we get that really is the question we have to ask. Because I agree with you. The cost doubles, but the output sometimes reduces rather than stay at the same level. And even if it stayed at the same level, it would have been halved. And if it is reducing, it's worse. And people complain about this. I mean, people complain about the police force, they complain about the hospital, they complain about teachers, they complain, and everybody gets their paycheck and go home. But the question is, do they earn it? Do they really earn it? Yes, there are some who do, but many who perhaps just are riding the tide. And that is, I think, where...
But that is where it's not an easy task.
No.
But I know a few months ago I was speaking to a senior public officer, asking them about the staff list. Which in my days in the public service, there was a thing called a staff list. So you could tell with relative certainty what the size of the public service was. But he could not respond. And I thought somewhere along the line, we seem to have lost touch on some of the fundamentals. We must now go to a break, but we'll be right back. Okay. Welcome back to the second segment. Before we continue, let me please remind you and request you to join in the discussion by sharing your thoughts on the topic and the discussion tonight. This can be done via email at businessperspective@belize.org, or you can post a comment on the Chamber's Facebook page, or better yet, for our members, you can use the virtual meeting place that is part of the Chamber's website portal. The address for that is www.belize.org/VMP. Mr. Waight, when we left, we were talking about the size of government, basically, and the expenditure, staffing, for example,
sure.
Which, from the outside, it seems to have gotten a little bit out of control. What do you? Is this a fair statement?
Well, you know, if you look back and you were to examine and see what your wage bill is as a percentage of your expenditure, it runs around 60% for many years. So that is fairly a constant. Of course, if one item in your expenditure makeup grows like public debt, then it's a numbers game. It gets smaller, but largely, and the size of the public sector right now is around 8,000 or 9,000, depending on the counting in teachers and the security forces, BDF and police. But that's not the whole picture. There are parastatals, or the public bodies that basically the government supports through transfers and through subsidies. KHMH being one. It was previously a government department. It was legislation, and it was changed into a parastatal, a little more autonomy and independence. But the government pays a fair amount of money every year to KHMH. It's not standing; it could never stand on its own, because it is a public hospital that provides it's the last resort or first resort in many cases. Similarly, the UB was an amalgamation of what used to be the Teachers College and the nursing school, and before that, the University College, I believe. Again, the government spends a lot of money in subsidy to try to keep the tuitions down. Baja is another example, and a couple others we can think about. But when you add those in, then the public sector gets really big. And of course, there's an interaction between the two. A wage increase on one side is the next day, So one has to be very careful. I have to say that we haven't really had a wage increase per se across the board, collective bargaining in the government service for some time now, almost 5 years, and we're trying to hold it down given the circumstances. The circumstances. There's these annual increments, however, that keep driving things, And also the government is a consumer of goods and services like anyone else. If the light bill goes up or the water bill goes up, but the government's perhaps the biggest client in all these, so we have to pay as well. But really, I guess your question is, are we getting the efficiency out of the system? Because it's taking a lot of resources, no doubt. And as a taxpayer, you're right, you want to be able to know that you can see where your money is going and you're getting some benefit for it. Or if you're not getting it directly, you're seeing the indirect benefit, but you want to see a benefit somehow. and particularly in the area of the light security and feeling of stability in the country. And
right. I think it also raises precisely that question: where are we spending the money?
Mm-hmm.
Are we putting it at? Are we servicing the issue that requires the most attention right now? I know it's a bit difficult for government to be as flexible as
mm-hmm.
others could be, but it's a pressing question when you look at the police, for example, mm-hmm. when you look at the recommendations of the Crooks report. And we know very well that implementing some of that would take a considerable amount of expenditure. And it raises a question based on the security concern: can we afford not to do it?
Well, you know, the question in a finite and limited resources is a question really of having to reallocate, and that's where the problem is.
Do
you take away, say, from education to give to security, or do you take away from health? Do you take social services? I mean, and that's where the balancing has to come in, because you know, you sit down every year and we try to develop a budget, and we know that we can perhaps maybe get 2 or 3% more of and the demands are far more on the other side. And how do you remember having to save some for investment as well, and some counterparting? I mean, that is, we borrow money from the IDB, the CDB, and other banks, but you have to put in a 15-20% of your own cash, and really that should be where that should have a priority claim as well, because that's the kind of investment you want to stimulate growth and to provide this enabling environment we spoke about. So really, it's a tough thing, and to
whether you like it or not, it will be robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Well, you have to take money from one pocket to another, because the entire pie isn't growing all the time. You know?
Right.
So it's a real challenge.
I think one of the things, Finsack, while the public will readily understand that, I think one of the weaknesses, however, is convincing people of these priorities and how these decisions are made. Mm-hmm. If we look, for example, over the past couple of weeks, we hear governments, Prime Minister made statements that we're going to write off certain amount of loans, and then he made the statement just before Christmas or before New Year's that we're going to do it again with the Social Security one. And then there was, I think, 1.7 million or thereabouts being given out to various constituencies. And the public hears one side. Public hears, oh, this is a good thing for those who will be given this benefit and all of that. But there's another side of the public who says who pays for it and where we get this money from. And then there's persons like myself who says, but we haven't gone to the National Assembly, and we haven't done it through the various regulatory mechanisms so that it would be managed by the public service, etc. And how is it being managed? And I will raise all those questions. When that happens, and then people say, oh, government can't afford. What you begin to hear is people say, well, government can't afford this because everybody has their pet project. Government can't afford to fix my street, but they could give away. People can't afford this. And I think you have to say to the government, they have a responsibility to air this in the manner that the populace will understand why this is being done, how is it being done, how it's being paid for, how it's being managed. Because, and if they jump out the pen, so to speak, with that information first, then you don't have these issues that are coming behind.
But you know, I agree with you fully, Senator, and in adding to that, I have a fundamental concern. I would not question so much when there is expenditure in education or for the police or the rest of it, but it really irks me when public money is being taken to buy Christmas goodies. It's difficult when we know that there's insufficient money for police, when there's insufficient money for the health system. Government really needs to be very, very careful with the little that it has.
Indeed, you know, but the question is, again, there's this balance and this competition between individual benefit and collective, individual good and collective good. You have, and I guess it's a system in which we live, but individual want something for themselves. They want that handout, they want the gift, they want something, you know. Even if it's a street, you want the part of the street in front of your house, you want the light in front of your house. There's also the collective, you know, and government finds itself in a dilemma, and then it's our system of, you know, our system as well, the whole election system, voting system, and so is the individuals, and the politician really gets into having to do a balance. You know, you try to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's the work. That really is to a certain extent the worrying trend.
But the balance, FinSec, to my mind, and you know clearly I will be speaking on it forever, is that I continue to maintain that there is this structure where you really sit at the top in terms of the functionability, the policy. The Prime Minister sits at the top.
Yep.
And so he goes to cabinet. I mean, there's the famous British parliamentarian, Lord, can't remember his name, a statement about no matter how you want to spend this money, he had a long speech. If you wanted to build a house for your sweetheart on the hill, that is fine, as long as you take it to the House of Parliament and get it approved, then so be it. I mean, you will pay the price at the election, you will pay the price with your wife, you will pay the price with the people on the street, but it's legal, it's done. And the functionaries then build that house, there's no question. And so we come back to that all the time. Going to the National Assembly with supplementaries, making your major speeches, doing your things. I felt, for example, that when this generous gift of 40,000 per constituency was going to be done, that the Prime Minister had the opportunity on that very Friday to have made a grandstand speech in his normal form, why you need to do it, how you could be, and swamp any criticism and get it passed through Parliament one time, and then you have the mechanism, and the various CEOs have the mechanism, the accounting officers have the mechanism to account for that fund and how it's going to be done and where it comes from, etc. Without that, you run the risk of playing catch up, because Auditor General has to, at some point, audit it. You have to account for it at some point. People have to find out where it's gone. There will be difficulty with receipts and who gave it out. That is the issue, more so, to my mind. Then you could downplay this argument about why you did it. Why is the policy? Yeah, it's not for you to decide. It's for those guys to decide. The how is where we come in all the time. And when I was in the service many years ago, that was always my issue and still is my issue. How it's done, how it's managed, and how we go from here. Because then you dispel all the criticism. If there's some criteria, you say, well, Lord, man, you must have a conscience. This is Christmas. They're poor people. They're indigent people. See them on the street. You take pictures. You show it around. People tears start to run, heart start to bleed. It's good. But at the same time, you could have come for it. But when you do it the other way, then you hear people say, oh, then you show my good cousin giving out, and you show the other minister giving out. Then some people say, I don't get. It opens up the whole...
That again, coming back to the topic, the trending, that is what is beginning to worry me, because we seem to be stepping away, and it's been going that way, in that direction for many, many years. That we seem to be stepping away from what was, in my mind, not fiscal prudence, because as you rightly say, it's the politicians that decide at the end of the day, but procedure and the transparency aspect of it. You know,
you're hitting on a point there. You have the executive and you got the legislature, and as you say, there's a huge overlap. Right. I mean, the executive essentially given we're taking a Westminster model, and in Britain, I think your cabinet must be 10% or less than your House of Parliament. Here it is almost...
it's 51. It's supposed to be 40% of who wins. But it is 51% basically of the House.
Yep.
So
you know, but you're taking a large system and trying to impose it on a small. Right. That's one of the faults that we have, not only Belize, but the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean.
Right,
you know. And there's not that separation, and that's... Okay, so that's one thing we have to deal with. It's here to stay. I don't see, unless we become a Republican system, I really don't. So let's see how we can work with what we have, with the cards that we have been dealt with. When it comes to now the accountability, and so indeed, as public officers, we try to make sure that we maintain and follow the as best as possible, particularly when it comes to getting value for money and the tendering and all of that. But there's inherent weaknesses, and the problem is that I think politicians are responding to the demands of the electorate. Right. You know, we come into when you're telling you criticize, you're just basically giving them. You've developed a system over time, and maybe it's a devolution where it's very individually driven, individual benefit, individual good, individual gain, at the expense of the collective. You know? But
the other side of that is also true, because while you can do that, and I still maintain that can be done, if we roll back to previous prime ministers and a previous period, if you go back to the first prime minister, Honorable George Price, and then you go back to Honorable Manuel Esquivel, you saw supplementaries coming, you saw them handing it over to the public service structure to carry out these wishes. And standing back. I mean, I was in the system back then. There was financial secretary, one of your predecessors, Mr. Fonseca. You couldn't get past him with nothing, and you couldn't go to the then prime minister to complain about him because he was saying, oh, no, man, no. If they have the money, I have it, even have it. Even when he was doing these goodies, because it has always happened. Yep. But that structure was maintained. So that, let us say he decides he's going to rub off housing loans for X amount of people, and this is the criteria. Then you go to the Ministry of Housing, and they stepped back out of the mix to make sure that if you didn't get yours, you could now go to complain. Yep. But this way now you see the ministers taking an active role, which in a way undermines that, because he's not supposed to really be the one out there who's making the determination, etc. That weakens the structure rather than strengthens the structure. And we've seen it with...
And it polarizes the community much more than really it should be.
You have a situation where you really don't, it's not desirable for the minister to become also the executive.
Exactly. Exactly.
You have the cabinet, then you have, of course, the legislature. But when it comes to the housing forgiveness, I looked at the long list. Much of these are historic loans that have gone bad. Yeah. And every year you're carrying this thing on your book, and every year you get a flag from IMF or something. Boy, why didn't you? So it's a tidy up operation. Now the question is, you know, how do you treat people at the margin? You know, how you establish a cutoff point and all of that. Are these things really collectible, or just wasting your time? I mean, are you having to spend money to maintain?
I agree with you. There's a large element of that on a lot of these programs that are just unrecoverable.
You know, we're going back to some housing 15, 20 years ago. I mean, that is try to get rid of it. Personally, I think that the government should then, having done that, wash its hand of being direct lenders and direct providers.
That's the other side.
Stay back and try to give it an agency to run, and maybe you could borrow the money, but back out of having to manage, and particularly when it comes to selection and that type of thing. But you're right. It could always be done perhaps a little bit more transparency, more information, so it doesn't draw the criticism it's drawing right now.
That's a point we will have to take up when we come back, but we must now go to a break.
Okay.
Welcome back to our third segment. Finsec, when we left, you were speaking on probably some reorientation, and really and truly, that's one of the trends we would like to see in terms of reorientation of some of the government expenditure. You spoke of housing. I am a firm believer that government has an purpose. They provide a public good in many respects, but there are certain things that really it raises the question as to whether or not they should be involved, at least involved directly on the front line. You mentioned housing, and I do agree with you fully. But what about some of the other areas? For example, the agriculture sector, or not the agriculture sector, the domestic marketing board, for example. And other areas. Senator, I know that's an issue for you too.
Well, if I may start it off and give the FinTech a little breather. You remember when we were making the first country report in Geneva to the WTO, one of the biggest issues that came up was these parastatals that we still were subsidizing. And in fact, if my memory serves me right, the US, Japan, China, the European Union all had big questions about it. I mean, I don't think they fathom our little marketing board and what it was doing in terms of trade, but it was the concept more than the actual size and investment. And I was forced, in fact, to defend something that was kind of anti-me. But we have to defend the country because we're out there. We can't join in bashing ourselves.
Right.
But we had promises back then when we had restructured the marketing board to the Belize Marketing and Development Corporation, that it would have evolved into something that one of these days would have been privatized in the trend of privatization. Some investors would have taken it over and it would have roared on like a thriving business with certain stability. In fact, just the opposite has happened. It hasn't gone there. and it continues to have these huge loans and continues to need subsidies from government, and one doesn't see the end results of all of this. We hear all the criticisms. Of course, the marketing board is in serious competition with other private sector players, particularly in rice, in the commercial sale of sugar, in onions, and all the rest of things. And even with that, it still continues to have this bottomless hole that needs to be filled by public sector money. The question anybody would ask, or any sensible businessman would ask, well, why you got it? I mean, you are in commodities that move. These are not things that are on your shelf like hardware goods or dry goods or other things. These are commodities that moves. I mean, everybody knows I have a commodity store in Belmopan. That's where we sell rice, sugar, and they move every day. And so you can't fathom the marketing board having the same thing, but still is always forever in the hole. And time again, because I sat on the board representing the chamber, I know of the difficulties. But there's just always another excuse around the corner. All right, we seem, this is it. And then there's another excuse around the corner. Or there's a change of government and it starts all over again. There is a new chairman, there is a new board, there is a new policy, and it goes on and on and on. There comes a point when you have to really pull the plug on that or really seriously restructure it and put it on its foot. 1 out of the 2. I think pulling the plug may be the better option at this stage.
I think one has to step back and say, well, look, what is the mandate? What's the objective that we have here? You know, I mean, that is, if indeed the marketing board is supposed to facilitate by helping the small growers to purchase the crop, store it, and then sell it, you know. But is that really, or is it a subsidy? Is it a subsidy? If it's a mechanism to give a subsidy, there might be more efficient ways of identifying and handing it out. I mean, it's a possibility because we do hear, I mean, and we feel it at the end of the day. If there's a failure, if there's a surplus, when you blend, you can't blend a social activity together with a commercial activity. Yeah. Something's going to come out of whack, and at the end of the day, somebody's going to have to pay, and you know, you end up the taxpayer. So, I think it's time to step back and look at the whole. And if in fact it's providing a social support to some small farmers, maybe there's another way of doing it. Find a mechanism maybe another way of doing it.
All right.
But one will have to see. But you know, and again, the whole question of government. I mean, that is, when it starts, governments have always been challenged to hand out subsidies and identifying the most needy. For instance, education. You know, that is, not everybody that gets a scholarship is is deserving, or should I say, some can pay. Some can pay. Right. Now we've had experiments where you borrow from a lending national bank. DFC, but even that may be a little too close to the government. You want a little distant and lend it and have the mechanisms, have the criteria, be more private oriented, and then you try to identify those that really need a subsidy and give them directly and call it what it is and where it is, and you put a cost to it and you put it in your budget, and therefore, again, it's a question of transparency and it's where you are. So things like that, you know, but it's going to take. It can't happen overnight, but one has to start, and essentially, what is it you want to do and how you want to get there?
Absolutely. I could not have said it better, because I really, we were discussing earlier the Goodies program, and that's precisely where I think we need to look at, where there is a need for the state intervention to assist those in need, then let's do it and let's call it that. But let's not jumble it up all together and then it becomes distorted. And we don't know, one, whether those that are truly deserving getting it, two, what the true cost of it is, and the minute we let it go, then it becomes a practice and a habit.
But again, it goes back to what Finsek said earlier, that kind of established in the structure, firewall between the policymaker, that's the cabinet per se, and the functionaries, starting with the Finsek, and the other finance officers and the whole public service structure. I mean, we have all the pieces of legislation in place, yes, to be renewed and upgraded, but they're there. The finance orders and it tells you how it works. And the ministers should be able to strut around and say, okay, our party has done good, this is what we're doing, we're helping the poor, look around, walk through, shake hand, and all that's what they do. But this whole business of managing all of this has to be managed through some decent structure. And even if you're looking at the marketing board, it can't be, if the policymakers decide, okay, we have to subsidize the farmers because they're struggling, they don't make a lot of money, they're being paid late, and then there's a mechanism to deal with that and create it and implement it. But you can't, like you said, have it under the guise of some commercial activity that is supposed to be independent and working and so on when it's not.
How do we bridge the gap in terms of providing mechanisms? I recall the planning of the medium-term economic strategy, for example. It's, from what I recall way back then, it used to be somewhat of an academic exercise where it's almost compilation of a wish list, but with very little matching to your budget. On the other hand, you have your budget, which appears to, and I hope it will change, but it appears to just be a year-on-year rollover or add-on, again without a bigger picture in terms of some forward planning. How can we marry the two of them? How can we get them together that, in addition to your that basically your budget planning becomes a part of your wider economic planning?
Yeah, the budget should support the overall program and objectives, and I guess through a process of consultation, and you have to identify, look, where is it you want agriculture to be, where you want education to be, try in the next 5 years. Develop a roadmap with time and input your resources there. But if it means having to take resources from one area to another, there's a question of prioritization and, and where it's going to come from. But say if your vision is that in 2020 or 2030 or what you want, so much percentage of your population to have university education. Well, what kind of resources do you need to put in now and next year and 5 years from to achieve that goal? And where is the money going to come from? But the incentives have to be there. And I still believe that some people have to pay a little more of their own. You can't socialize everything.
I agree.
The problem with that of FinSec is that no matter, even if we talk some long-term planning, which that would require, we're still locked mentally into a 5-year term.
That's true.
Which is the term of government. And we all know this. I mean, this is practiced in Belize and elsewhere in the English-speaking Caribbean, where the opposition plays no role, doesn't go to any meetings, participate in nothing, because they wait their turn. And when they win, it's their policies now. And that may just be a brutal cut-off of an existing policy and everything attendant to it and with it, and starting off a new structure. And we've seen this over and over. There have to be some mechanism. I thought, for example, two things. I thought when the IDB had sponsored and you all had passed or issued that fiscal transparency
responsibility
SI, that built in a structured development of reporting to culminate fully in 2013, which is after next. That was a tremendous step along the road, because everybody will follow that. It is not that another government comes and cuts that off. And then the recent business forum, where I had suggested that we have an investment law per se, and the Prime Minister said he would go with that, because if we develop it properly, it gives the kind of structure and confidence. Building on those two things, we could then come up with some sort of education policy, or education, not the education bill that we have, that is good, but a policy built into a law which everybody supports. And then you know this drives you long term. So you don't have to worry that the next government is going to change that. They will just have to find ways to better fund it or to manage it better. Those, to my mind, are the kinds that we're at that place now where we need that kind of thing. And a good agriculture policy. You know, I have harped for 30 years on this whole business of food security and self-sufficiency, which I think is downright crazy, given our small population. The people who had sponsored that in the UN did so because they were trying to take particularly basic commodities out of the control of the WTO, which was reasonable. And they needed food security and self-sufficiency for their populations. That was Mexico, Indonesia, China, India, and Brazil. Look at them. How does Belize fit into that? We had 120,000 people, please. We should be on the other side saying, well, we can help to supply you to have this food, this food security. Because I maintain, for example, the same functions of the BMDC. If it were the other way around, that it was the window to the outside world, then it's like having a restaurant. Your children will eat. That's a given. You don't have to worry about providing food for your children. They will eat.
And you will sell to others.
And you will sell to others. And this has got to be the thing that will drive us. So you need that sort of education policy, agriculture policy. How are we going to do these things? And and get on with it. And I thought the present government, with its tremendous mandate, has a golden opportunity to put those on board, not only in a manifesto for our next election, but to enact it now, before our next election, to say, this is where we'd want to go. And open it the same way we opened the 9th, now 8th Amendment to nationwide discourse. Do it that way and be done with it. And then you know that as the functionary, when you're doing the budget, you know that a certain portion minimum will be allocated to that, but it's previously agreed to by the whole nation, so to speak. In other words, I know already there's limited resources. So I will forego the holes in the street because I know they're educating 500 more children at the tertiary level. And I know that down the road, that is going to be 500 more people who will have a better education in this country, and therefore less tendency to gangs, less tendency to whatever.
One of the, another part of that question of the reorientation is also to the preparation that's required to service our growing debt.
Yeah.
Whether we like it or not, we have a debt that's really will reach crisis mode pretty soon if we don't address it properly. We don't see the economic growing from the private sector perspective. We don't see the economic growing to meet that capacity. So it's an urgent thing. It's not 20 years down the road. It's on our doorstep already.
7 years from now, if not. Now, the thing is, you know, the way the debt is structured. I mean, we're talking about half our debt is in one instrument we call the super bond, and the way that is set up. Interest only for the first 12 years, from 2007 to 2019, and then repayments for 10 more years beyond that, from 2019 to 2029. Come 2019, the first repayment, remember the bond is $546 million US. So if we pay it in 10 annual installments, that's $54.6 million US in repayment every year for 10 years beginning 2019 going on to
plus the interest at 8%.
And interest at 8.5%, which is another $46 million or so, US. So really in 2019, we will have to pay $46 million interest in the first, plus another 54. We're looking at $100 million in US dollars. Simply, we will not be able to pay that. So
plus the other debt that we have currently servicing.
So what options do we have for us? We can't pay it out. I mean, that is, we'll not be in a position to pay it completely off. The other option is to see if we can refinance it. But to do that, we have to bring ourselves into a position of credit worthiness where we can go back out and hopefully refinance it at a lower rate. Market rates now are much lower than they were at the time. But to do that, you have to put yourself in a very strong borrowing position. That means that you have to, and your credit rating agencies have to recognize that and give you a better score than we're getting at the moment. How do you put yourself in a very strong, better improve your borrowing capacity, improve your credit worthiness? Simply you have to save more. So the pressure will be on the government to generate the fiscal savings, generate the foreign reserves, so that we look like a better candidate to borrow. And you go out and say, look, something is coming due, and I issue a new bond, perhaps a shorter period, perhaps at a lower interest rate, the market rates, you know, and to pay it, and with a program of how you're going to pay it down. But the critical thing is to generate the savings now and to build the foreign reserves now to be able to face that when it comes up not too long from now.
Yeah.
But it's a challenge because remember we have declining income from the oil sector, declining production, you know, and other things. So really, what we would need is primary balances in the tune of 3.5–4% or so.
Yeah.
We're doing 2 right now, which is good compared to regionally, but it's not sufficient
to put us in that place.
So,
yeah.
So the challenge that the government has is to squeeze its expenditure down, hold on its expenditure to try to boost its revenue equitably, you know, try to be able to generate a surplus and then not to spend it. Because the temptation will be to spend the surplus. Huh?
Thinking, it's looking at that macro picture and thinking that way is what raises everything on me when I hear the Prime Minister say, okay, we will write off this or we will do this. Because if I were in the lending business, and everybody knows this is a one world. You drop your voice, this show, by the time it's aired, you're hearing it in Moscow, South Africa, wherever. People say, oh my goodness, but they got money. This is the general tendency. Even though at the IMF level and everybody, they will be looking at the numbers. And that's why I think it is very paramount and critical that when government does this, they launch it with the maximum of explanation, with the maximum of details, with the maximum of transparency, so we don't get into this confusion, because that is where the problem comes. And we're human beings, and no matter how smart the guy at the World Bank is, these things rub on him. I mean, if I'm sitting and my wife say, "Oh, how come you say, oh, no, can't do this, but I see, they do that and that and that," then I will have to go through hoops to try to explain to her why I can't.
Yeah, perhaps a little more information. You're not foregoing income that you otherwise would be collecting. These are dead loans, and maybe
yes, but I'm saying we
hear
hear this.
We know that, but
yes,
for public consumption.
Yes,
huh?
yes.
Just like the money, time has run out on us. We'll be right back.
It has run out completely.
Yeah.
Welcome back. We ran quite a bit over time. FinSec, 10 seconds wrap up if that's possible.
Well, to thank you, and essentially to say, look, public finances is everybody's business. It's not only for the government. Senator is right. Taxpayers have a right to know how the money is being spent and to question where it's going. Also have a question to say that it's going to be spent properly and equitably and to get the most value for money. Now the question, where are we going with this? The government realizes it. It's trying to do its best to be able to husband its resources and to try to ensure that whatever new systems we put in place are an improvement on the current arrangements we have, particularly when it comes to collecting money equitably and then spending it wisely.
Thank you. Senator?
FinSec sits in the functioning side of government. The Prime Minister sits in the decision side of government. I sit in the oversight side of government, which is the Senate. All three can work real well together. We need to get it done, particularly in 2012.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much, FinSec, for coming, and Senator for coming, and for your candid discussion. We hope to have you two back, because we were just getting all excited and time ran out. I will say no more except to say thank you for tuning in, and see you next week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, Joe. Yeah.